The silver halls of Caerhun had never held so many wolves. Mavel pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the upper gallery, her pulse crashing against her ribs as she watched the ceremony unfold below. 1,000 white candles blazed from the horn chandeliers, casting a trembling golden light over the faces of pack elders, border lords, and common folk who had ridden through 3 days of spring rain to witness this moment. She should not have come. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to the small herb room beneath the eastern stair where she had hidden for 4 days waiting for Rovan to send word. But he had sent nothing. No folded note, no whispered message through a loyal page. Only silence that had grown heavier with every passing hour. And so she had come to see the truth with her own eyes. The Alpha King stood on the black stone dais at the far end of the hall, his shoulders squared beneath the ceremonial mantle of gray wolf hide and hammered silver. Even from this distance, Mavel could make out the proud line of his jaw, the dark hair cut shorter than when she had last traced her fingers through it, the stillness in his bearing that made every lesser wolf in the hall tilt their eyes downward in instinctive submission. For nearly a year she had known a different version of him, the man who set her name into the hollow of her shoulder, as if it were a prayer he could not stop whispering. The man whose hand shook the first time he touched her face, as if she were something he feared to break. The man who had pressed his mouth to the half-moon mark on the inside of her wrist, the secret claiming bite he had given her the night he swore before the old oaks that she was the one his wolf had waited for. When the spring council disperses, he had promised her, his breath warm against her pulse, I will stand before the realm and name you. You will be Queen of Caerhun Mavel, and no one will unmake what we are. She had believed him with every part of herself. Her palm moved, almost without her permission, to rest against her lower belly. Another secret grew there, a secret she had rehearsed telling him 100 times in the dim light of her herb room. A secret she had planned to speak into his mouth tonight when he came to her through the servant's door as he always did. Let the chosen approach, the High Warden called out, his old voice rolling through the hushed chamber. Mavel's nails bit crescents into her palms as 4 women in pale gray silk ascended the dais. Daughters of the 4 cardinal bloodlines, trained from their first steps for precisely this moment. At the head of them, with hair the color of pale river reeds and eyes that caught the candlelight like frost over water, walked Andrina of House Ivar. A murmur of approval rose from the gathered nobles. The Ivars had held the northern passes for 6 generations and could field 2,000 sworn warriors within a week. They had been grooming Andrina since she was a child. Mavel searched Rovan's face for any sign of the man she knew. A flicker of softness, a glance toward the galleries. Any hint of the love he had sworn was older than both their lifetimes. His face was carved from winter stone. Rovan, Alpha King of Caerhun, last of the line of Tauren, the warden intoned. You have heard the council of elders. You have weighed the bindings of blood and border. Speak your sealing. The silence stretched long enough to hurt. Mavel stopped breathing. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, twice, a heat that climbed into her throat. Surely he could feel it answering her. Surely he would lift his eyes and find her in the gallery's shadows and say what they had whispered to each other under the oaks. At the far end of the gallery, a guard moved. His lantern swung in her direction, and Mavel ducked lower, one hand pressed flat to the cold stone pillar. The light passed. The guard continued his round. Her breath returned in a shallow, ragged pull. When she lifted her eyes again, Rovan had already stepped forward. Something in his walk was wrong. His stride was too rigid, too measured, as if each step had to be remembered before it was taken. And his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had always held her like she was something rare and precious, looked past Andrina without landing on her. Past the warden. Past the hall itself. I seal my line. His voice came out flat and strange, to Andrina of House Ivar. The chamber detonated with sound. Horns blew, nobles embraced. Warriors pounded their gauntleted fists against their breastplates. A political knot 7 generations in the making had been tied in a single sentence. Mabel felt something behind her ribs come apart like wet paper. The mark on her wrist flared with a heat so sudden and so terrible that she gasped aloud and doubled against the pillar. It was not the warm pulse of the bond she knew. It was something burning, as if the memory of his teeth were being peeled from her skin one nerve at a time. Through the blur of her tears, she watched him accept Andrina's hand. Watched him raise her fingers to his mouth in the old gesture. Watched the woman smile with the clean pride of a victor while the man Mayfell loved showed nothing at all. He did not search for her. He did not hesitate. He did not seem to remember her name. A sob tore itself out of her throat, swallowed whole by the roaring hall. She turned, her shoulders striking the pillar, her knees refusing her weight for one terrible instant. Then she was moving, stumbling, and half blind, through the servants' passage behind the gallery. The back corridors were abandoned. Every servant in Carowin had gone to watch the ceiling. Mayvel ran through the dim stone tunnels with one hand pressed over her burning wrist and the other curled protectively over her belly. The child, his child, growing inside her while he sealed himself to another. She would not stay in this castle. She would not stand in a crowd and watch him wed Andrina at midsummer. She would not remain where she had believed every word he had ever spoken to her, where she had been fool enough to think a quiet healer from the river villages could ever truly hold the heart of a king. Her herb room was a small square of dim light. She packed with shaking fingers 2 dresses, the small carved elk her grandmother had given her when she was 7. A folded bundle of dried yarrow and silver leaf for the sickness that had plagued her every morning for the last 2 months. She paused at the narrow window. Below, across the city, the first celebration fires were being lit. Somewhere in that blaze of light, Rovan was accepting the toasts of men who had never known her name, and no one, not one soul in all of Carowin, knew that the Alpha King's true mate was slipping through the kitchen gate with his hair curled beneath her heart. Mayvel pressed her lips to 2 fingertips and touched them to the cold glass. "Live well without me," she whispered to the night beyond. "May she be the queen you needed." She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and stepped through the servants' gate, swallowed by the wet spring dark. She did not see the torch flicker in the high window of the northern tower. She did not see the storm-gray eyes that suddenly, desperately, woke. And she did not hear the howl that tore open the sky above Carowin 10 minutes later, a sound so raw that wolves in villages a day's ride away lifted their heads and whimpered at nothing they could name. By the time Rovan reached her herb room, Mayvel was already 3 leagues into the rain. 7 years could turn a woman into a stranger, even to herself. The woodcutter's daughter in the village of Briarmoss called her Wren, and the name had long since stopped feeling borrowed. So had the low cottage at the edge of the birchwood, with its mossy roof and crooked chimney and the small herb garden that had grown, season by season, into the most reliable apothecary for 50 miles. The farmers brought her their fevered children. The shepherds brought her their lambing troubles. The old women of the village brought her their grief, and their stiff knees and their small practical sorrows, and she met each with the same calm hands and the same quiet voice. Only the boy knew that her name was not Wren. He did not know what her name was, but he knew, the way children always know, that the name she answered to in the village was not the one she whispered to herself at night. Kalen was 6 years old that spring, 7 by autumn. He had his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's careful stillness, and he could already name 34 herbs by sight and smell. Mayvel had told him their names the way other mothers told bedtime stories. Fennel for colic, comfrey for bone, mugwort for dreams too heavy to carry. He repeated them back to her in his soft, serious voice, and she felt for a moment each time that the 7 years of her exile had built something rather than stolen it. She did not tell him about the mark on her wrist that had never faded. She did not tell him about the dreams that came most nights, dreams in which a man with storm-gray eyes walked through rooms she did not recognize, calling a name that was hers and not hers. She did not tell him about the way the wind, when it blew from the west, still smelled faintly of the silver halls of Carowin and broke something small inside her chest every time. She did not tell him that the scar on her wrist was not a scar. Among wolfkind, a rejected mark was supposed to pale and smooth within a single turning of the moon, leaving nothing but clean skin and the clean grief of an ending. Mavel's mark had done neither. It had stayed dark as iron. It had pulsed at the strangest hours, quiet and insistent, like someone knocking at a door on the far side of the world. And when the wind came from the west, it burned. She told herself this was only the body's stubborn memory. False hope, she had learned early in her exile, was a slower poison than any she knew how to brew. The morning the world began to find her again started ordinary. Kaelin was sitting at the kitchen hearth, threading dried rose hips onto a length of thin twine, when he looked up and said, "A man came into the square yesterday asking for a woman with a scar shaped like half a moon." Mavel's hands stopped moving over the mortar. "Did he now?" she said, and was proud of how steady her voice stayed. "He was asking the baker." Kaelin's small, serious face turned toward her. "The baker did not know. He gave him bread, and the man went away." "What did he look like?" "Tall. Gray cloak. He had a scar on his chin." Kaelin paused, threading another rose hip. "He smelled like wolf." Mavel's stomach dropped so hard she had to set both palms flat on the table. "Kaelin," she said, and she made herself look at him, made her voice ordinary. "If that man comes to the village again, you do not tell him anything about me, not my name, not where we live, nothing. Do you understand me?" He nodded once, the slow nod of a child who has learned that his mother's strange rules always matter. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the small main room of the cottage with a paring knife in her lap and watched the door until the sun came gray through the window. 3 days passed. Then 4. The tall man did not come to the cottage. Mavel began foolishly to breathe again. On the 5th morning, a knock came. It was only Heston, the widow from down the lane, her face bright with the particular excitement of someone carrying news too large for her mouth. "Wren, have you heard? Riders came down the western road last night. King's men. They are in every village between here and Falren asking questions. They say there is a king gone half mad up in Carowin, and he is tearing the north apart looking for someone." The floor of the cottage tilted very slowly beneath Mavel's feet. "Looking for who?" she asked. "A woman. That is all anyone says. He has offered land, Wren. Land and silver. To anyone with word of her." Heston's eyes gleamed with the unself-conscious hunger of a woman who had never owned anything larger than a single goat. "They say the harvest has failed in 3 provinces. They say wolves are going feral in the forests. They say—" She crossed herself in the old southern way. "They say he stopped eating. His own council is frightened of him." "Thank you, Heston," Mavel heard herself say. "I will put this in my prayers." When the widow was gone, Mavel closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood. Her wrist was burning so hot she could feel the heat rising through her sleeve. He was looking for her. Why would a king tear his kingdom apart searching for a woman he had publicly sealed himself away from? Why would he rise from the wedding bed of another woman and ride through 7 winters of forests to find a healer nobody had ever heard of? Unless something had been wrong that night in the silver halls. Unless the stillness in his face, the flatness in his voice, had not been what she had believed it was. She pressed her hand against her belly, an old gesture that no longer matched her body. Kaelin was at the hearth, watching her. "Mother," he said. "You are crying." She had not realized. That night she packed 2 cloaks, a knife, 3 purses of silver she had hidden beneath the hearthstone across 7 winters. She wrote a letter to Heston to feed the goats and burned it and wrote it again. She did not sleep. At the gray hour before dawn, the mark on her wrist went cold. It had never done that before. It burned, it pulsed, it ached, but it had never in 7 years gone cold. Mavelle sat bolt upright in her bed, her hand clutching her wrist as if something inside it had stopped. Kaelin stood in her doorway. He was in his nightshirt, barefoot, his dark hair tangled from sleep. His storm-gray eyes were wide and unblinking. "Mother," he whispered, "there are wolves in the garden." She rose slowly. She walked to the window. She parted the curtain with one finger. 4 wolves stood between the birch trees at the edge of her garden. Not the Brindle village dogs that sometimes came scavenging. These were huge, clean-limbed, silver and slate and the color of wet iron, and their eyes were the bright, intelligent amber of wolves who had once been men. They were not moving. They were watching the cottage with the patient focus of hunters who had finally reached the end of a very long trail. A 5th shape stepped between them. A man. Tall. Gray-cloaked. A scar on his chin. He lifted one hand slowly, palm out, the old northern gesture for peace, and he began to walk toward her door. Mavelle moved Kaelin behind her before she opened the door. She did not open it all the way. She held it at the length of her own forearm, the paring knife tucked backward against her wrist in the way her grandmother had shown her when she was 9. The man on her step saw the blade. His eyes flicked down to it, and then back up to her face. And something in his expression softened, as if the knife had confirmed something he had hoped to find. "My lady," he said, and the word struck her like a small flat stone. "My name is Varric. I was the king's 2nd shield before the year of your leaving. I have ridden for 7 years looking for you." "You have the wrong woman," she said. Her voice came out steady. "My name is Ren. I am a widow and a healer. Please leave my step." "You bear a half-moon mark on the inside of your left wrist," Varric said quietly. "You have a son with storm-gray eyes, and the king has described both of these things to every rider in the realm for 7 years." The paring knife trembled once in her hand and then was still. Behind her, Kaelin was silent. She could feel the heat of his small body against the back of her knee. "May I come in?" Varric said. "Alone. My men will remain at the edge of the garden. I have something I must tell you that should not be told on a doorstep." She did not want to let him in. She wanted to shut the door and bar it and pack her son onto her back and run into the birch wood and not stop until her legs gave under her. But she had run already. She had run for 7 years, and the wolves in her garden had still found her. And she knew, the way a healer knows when a fever has turned, that the running was over. She stepped aside. Varric entered slowly, the way a man enters a chapel. He did not look at Kaelin. He understood clearly what it would cost her if he looked at the boy with recognition on his face. He sat at her small wooden table with his hands flat on the wood where she could see them, and he waited. "Kaelin," Mavelle said, "go and feed the goats." "It is still dark, mother." "Take the lantern. Go." He looked up at her, and she watched her own distrust pass across his face, like the shadow of a bird. Then he nodded, slid his feet into his small boots, and went out through the kitchen door. The latch clicked behind him. Mavelle sat down across from Varric. She did not put the knife away. "Speak," she said. "He did not seal himself to Andrina of House Ivara," Varric said. The room went very still. "I watched him do it," Mavelle said. "From the upper gallery. With my own eyes." "You watched a body wearing his face." Varric's voice was low and steady, a voice that had clearly rehearsed this telling for years. 3 nights before the sealing, the king was given a cup by the High Warden. The cup held oil of silverthroat, a draught the old keepers use on dying wolves to quiet the mind before the end. Administered to a living alpha, in the measure he drank, it does not kill, it hollows. For 9 days and 9 nights after he drank it, Roventorin walked and spoke and ate and signed papers, and his wolf was not inside him. His wolf was elsewhere, pacing the walls of a cage none of us could see. He remembers nothing of those 9 days. Not the ceiling, not the wedding feast, not the first 4 nights of what was supposed to be his marriage. Mavel's free hand closed on the edge of the table. On the 10th morning he woke, Varric said, and he was himself again. And the first thing he did before he asked for water, before he asked where he was scream your name. She could not speak. We went to your herb room. You were gone. We found the cup you had used to pack your yarrow. We found the small carved elk you had forgotten on the shelf. We found nothing else. Your trail was 4 days cold by the time he was himself enough to follow it. Varric's jaw worked once. He has not stopped looking since. 7 years, Mavel whispered. 7 years? He married her. He did not, Varric said. The sealing was witnessed, yes. The marriage itself was never consummated. He would not touch her. Even hollowed, even with his wolf caged, something in him knew. Andrina has lived in the eastern wing of the Silver Halls for 7 years as his wife in name and no other way. The High Warden told her that if she was patient, she would outlast you. She has not. Why? Mavel said. The word came out cracked. Why would the Warden? Because Andrina's mother is his sister. Varric's eyes were flat. Because with Rovan hollowed and bound by oath to an Ivar queen, the Warden's line would have stood one small death away from the throne of Carowin. One small, tragic, easily arranged death. Mavel felt her knees want to give. She made them hold. There is more, my lady, and I would rather not tell you the rest on this side of a cup of water, but I do not have the time. Varric reached inside his coat. This was intercepted 4 weeks ago, riding north out of a village 2 days from here. He laid a folded parchment on the table between them. The wax was broken, but the seal was legible. A coiled silver throat vine, the old sigil of the High Warden's house. She opened it. The whelp's mother has been located in the western birch lands. The whelp will be found with her. Remove both before the next new moon. Long silence to House Ivar. Her hand, which had held steady through so much, began at last to shake. The whelp, she said. Your son, my lady. They know about him. They have known for a long time. We believe they have known almost from his birth. The only reason he has lived this long is that we have known for a long time as well, and we have made certain their hunters reached you second. Varric paused. We did not make it second this time. Outside, beyond the cottage wall, a sudden thin howl cut the air. Not one of Varric's wolves. The pitch was wrong. Varric was on his feet before the sound had finished. My lady, where is your son? I sent him to feed the goats. Varric went white. Mavel was already moving. She was through the kitchen door before her mind had caught up to her body. The paring knife still in her hand, her feet bare on the dew. The lantern was on the ground by the goat pen. It was still burning. Kaelin was not beside it. Kaelin. Her voice came out of her like something torn. Kaelin! Varric was at her shoulder. My lady, stand back. Let my men... And then, from the dark tree line, she heard her son cry out. He was not screaming. He was doing something worse than screaming. He was saying in his small, serious voice, Do not touch me. Do not touch me. Do not touch me. Over and over, the way she had taught him to say it if a stranger ever came too close in the village square. 3 shapes stepped out of the birches. Not wolves. Men. Men in soft dark leather, masked in black cloth, one of them holding her son by the back of his nightshirt with one gloved hand. The boy's small bare feet dangled just above the wet grass. He was not crying. He was staring at Mavel with the wide, unblinking calm of a child who has understood, in a single instant, that the world his mother had promised him was a lie. The man holding him lifted a short curved blade to the side of Kaelin's throat. Mistress Wren, said the masked man, in a pleasant, almost apologetic voice. Or should we use your proper name? Step away from the second shield. Kneel in the grass with your hands behind your head. Do it now, and the boy will live long enough to see what we do with you. Refuse, and he will not see the sunrise. Varric's hand closed on her shoulder. My lady, he said, very quietly, do not kneel. In the same instant, a sound began in the birchwood behind the masked men. It was not a howl. It was deeper than a howl. It was the low, building hum of something the size of a horse moving through underbrush at full run, and it was coming fast, and the mark on Mayvel's wrist, which had gone cold an hour ago and stayed cold, was suddenly, searingly, impossibly, blazing with heat. The masked man's head began to turn toward the sound. He did not finish the turn. The thing that came out of the birchwood was black and silent, and very fast. Mayvel saw the masked man's arm begin to move, the curved blade angling inward toward her son's throat, and she heard herself make a sound that had no word in it. In the same breath, the huge black wolf was across the clearing. It did not leap. It simply arrived, the way a thrown stone arrives at a window, and the masked man and his curved blade were no longer holding Kaelin. They were in the wet grass, and the blade was in the dirt, and the wolf's jaws were closed on the masked man's shoulder, with a sound like a beam of dry wood splitting under rain. The other two masked men turned to run. Varric's wolves came out of the garden for them. What happened after that happened in the dark and was over quickly, and Mayvel did not watch. She was already on her knees in the grass with her arms full of her son. Kaelin did not cry. He pressed his face into her collarbone and breathed in the specific familiar smell of her neck, the way he had done when he was small and woke from bad dreams. His small bare feet were ice. She wrapped her cloak around him and rocked him once, twice, and whispered the same 3 words she had whispered to him for 7 years whenever the world had frightened him. I am here. I am here. I am here. Behind her, the great black wolf lowered the masked man's body to the grass and stepped back from it. Then it turned. Its eyes were the color of a winter storm. Mayvel had known, from the first moment she heard the sound in the wood, what it was. Her body had known before her mind had. The mark on her wrist was still burning, a heat that matched the heat pouring off the wolf in visible waves in the cold dawn air. But knowing did not prepare her for the size of him, or the silence, or the way his enormous shaggy head lowered when he took his first step toward her, as if he were trying to make himself smaller for her sake. Kaelin, who had not yet lifted his face from her neck, felt her go still and turned. He looked at the wolf. The wolf stopped walking. The two of them, the great dark animal and the small gray-eyed child, regarded each other across 6 feet of wet spring grass. Kaelin did not flinch. The wolf did not blink. And between them, slow and shimmering as heat rising off a summer road, Mayvel felt something she had not felt in 7 years. The bond. Not her bond. His. The boy's. A thin, clean, unmistakable thread of recognition, stretching from her son's small chest to the enormous wolf in front of them, as if some part of Kaelin that she had never been able to name had just opened a door inside him and found, on the other side, the shape it had been waiting for. The wolf made a sound. It was not a whimper and not a growl. It was the sound a man makes when he has held his breath for 7 years and is no longer certain how to let it out. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, the wolf was not a wolf. Rovin Torin knelt in the wet grass of her garden, barefoot, his shirt torn open at the shoulders, heaving as if he had just swum across a winter sea. His dark hair was longer than when she had last touched it. There was gray in it now, at the temples, that had not been there 7 years ago. His face was thinner. There was a scar she did not recognize, running from the corner of his jaw down into the collar of his throat. He did not stand up. He stayed on his knees in the grass, and he looked at her, and then he looked at the child in her arms, and then he looked at her again, and his mouth opened once without sound. Mayvel, he said. Her name in his mouth undid something in her that 7 years in a stranger's village had not been able to loosen. Do not speak to me yet, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she had meant it to, but steady. My son is cold. I am taking him inside. You will wait here. Rovan nodded once. He did not rise. She carried Kaelin past him. She did not look down. She walked through the kitchen door and set her son on the warm stone of the hearth, and pulled a wool blanket around him and put the kettle on the hook, and moved through the small motions of her life, because the small motions were the only thing holding her together. Kaelin watched her with his wide, solemn eyes. He did not ask her who the man in the garden was. He did not ask her anything. He only held the edge of the blanket in both small fists and watched her. Varric came in through the kitchen door, his face careful. My lady, the king is still outside. He will stay outside as long as you require. But he is hurt. He rode 3 days without stopping. He has not eaten. Then feed him, Mayvel said. She did not look up from the kettle. There is bread in the crock and cheese in the cold box. I am not ready to see him yet. Varric inclined his head and went out. She stayed at the kettle for a long time. When she finally turned, Kaelin was looking at her. Mother, he said in his small, careful voice, that man in the garden. He is the man from your dreams. She sat down slowly on the hearthstone beside him. How do you know about my dreams, Kaelin? You say his name sometimes, when you are sleeping. He looked at the fire. You never told me his name out loud, but you say it when you are sleeping. She had no answer to give him that was not a lie or a confession, and she was not ready for either. So she held him. She held him until the kettle began to hiss, and then she rose, and she made tea for 3. She went out into the garden an hour after sunrise. Rovan was sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of her herb beds. A torn-off chunk of bread was in one of his hands and had evidently been there for some time because he had not taken a bite of it. Varric and his men had withdrawn to the tree line. The dead in the grass had been carried off somewhere she did not want to ask about. She stopped 3 paces from the wall. Varric told me about the silver throat, she said. Rovan closed his eyes. Is it true? She said. Every word. You sealed yourself to her. My body stood in a hall and signed a paper my mind was not inside of, he said. His voice was hoarse, but it did not waver. When I came back to myself and learned what had been done, I threw her out of the wing of the castle I had slept in. I have not let her closer than a corridor since. The warden has kept her there. I could not have her executed without proof, and by the time we had proof enough, you had already been gone for 3 years. 3 years, Mayvel said. 3 years to find the proof. 4 more to find you. He opened his eyes. Mayvel, I was told in the 4th year that you had died in a fever in the southern provinces. The warden's household produced a body. I buried her on the hill behind the silver halls. I spent 2 years believing I had buried you. The grass under her bare feet felt suddenly very far away. Who was she? Mayvel whispered. A village healer the warden had murdered for the purpose of the lie. I did not learn that until last winter. His hand closed on the bread and did not seem to notice. When I learned it, I understood that if they had gone to the trouble of faking your death, it was because you were still alive. And if you were alive, you were hiding. And if you were hiding from me as much as from them. Because no one had told you what had been done, I have been riding every road in the north since the thaw. Your kingdom, she said, is bleeding. He said it simply. The harvests have failed in 3 provinces. The border packs have begun to refuse my summons. My own wolf has been losing himself in the running. Varric has been quietly holding the court together with his teeth for 2 years. If I do not return within the month with something that explains the last 7 years, I will have no throne to return to. Then go back. Not without you. Rovan, not without you. His storm-gray eyes lifted to hers. And not without him. She drew in a long, slow breath. His name is Kaelin, she said. Rovan's face did something she did not have a name for. He has your eyes, she said. He has my hands. He has known 34 herbs by name since he was 5. He has never once asked me who his father was, because somewhere in himself he already knew that if I could have told him, I would have. Rovan rose from the wall. He did not come toward her. He stood in the cold spring light in his torn shirt and his bare feet, and he said, very quietly, "May I meet him?" She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said, "but you will do it on his terms, not yours. You will kneel when you speak to him. You will not touch him. You will ask him his name, and you will wait for him to give it. And you will not mind if he does not give it the first time. Do you understand me?" "Yes. He is mine, Rovan. I know. He has always been mine. I know, Mayvel." She nodded once and turned toward the cottage. At the door she stopped. "The warden," she said, without turning. "Is he still alive?" "He is still alive. Not for much longer." "No," Rovan said quietly. "Not for much longer." She opened the door and went inside, and a moment later she opened it again and stepped aside, and the Alpha King of Carowan walked into the small kitchen of a healer in a village he had never heard of, and knelt on the stone floor at a respectful distance from a 6-year-old boy with storm-gray eyes, and waited. They rode east 3 days later, in a small, quiet company with Kaelin wrapped in a fur in front of his mother on a quiet gray mare. Mayvel had insisted on the pace. Rovan had wanted to travel by night and cross the western provinces in 4 days. She had refused. Kaelin had never been on a horse for more than an hour in his life. Kaelin had never been outside of Briar Moss. Kaelin did not yet know that the quiet man who had appeared in their kitchen was his father, and Mayvel had told Rovan, with the flat calm of a woman who had made this decision alone in the dark for 7 years, that he would learn that truth when she decided he was ready and not a moment before. Rovan had accepted all of it without a word of argument. He rode beside them in silence for most of the first day. He did not try to hold her hand. He did not try to speak to the boy. When Kaelin grew tired in the afternoon and leaned back against his mother's chest, Rovan drew his own cloak from his shoulders without a word and passed it across so that she could wrap it around the child. The cloak smelled of wood smoke and cold stone and something older, something that for 7 years she had only smelled in her sleep. She held it around her son and did not look at the man who had given it. On the second night, at a camp in a pine hollow, Kaelin fell asleep between her and the fire. Rovan was sitting across the flames from her, his elbows on his knees, his hands folded in the space between them. He had not eaten much. Varric had ridden ahead to the next watch post. They were, for the first time in 7 years, effectively alone. "Tell me about him," Rovan said quietly. "Please." She looked at her son's sleeping face for a long moment. Then she began to tell him. She told him about the first winter, when Kaelin had been born in the cottage loft, with only Heston the widow to help her, and she had nearly bled to death on the straw. She told him about the first word, which had been the word for star. She told him about the fever in the second spring, when she had thought she would lose him, when she had sat awake for 3 nights singing her grandmother's river song to him until the fever broke at dawn. She told him about the first time he had named a herb without being told. She told him about the afternoon he had come in from the garden with his small hands full of mugwort and said, very seriously, "Mother, this one is for dreams too heavy to carry." Rovan did not speak through any of it. When she finally stopped, he closed his eyes, and she saw 2 tears move down his face without any change in his expression at all. "I missed him," he said. "You missed everything." "I know." "He said his first word," she said, "to a shelf of herbs. I was not even in the room." "I know, Mayvel." She had not known she was going to cry until she was crying. It came out of her quietly, the way a river comes out of ground that has been holding it for a long time, and she did not cover her face or apologize, and Rovan did not move from the far side of the fire. He let her weep. He sat across from her with his hands folded, and he let her weep the 7 years out of her body. And when she was done, he said, very softly, "Mayvel, may I come sit nearer?" Not yet, she said. All right. But a little after that, without either of them naming the moment, she found that she had moved to his side of the fire, and that her head had come to rest against his shoulder, and that his arm had gone very carefully around her. The way a man handles something he is afraid is already broken. Kaelin slept between them and did not wake. Rovan did not try to kiss her. He did not try to speak. He only sat with her in the dark and breathed, and after a long time she felt the mark on her wrist, which had burned for 7 years and gone cold for an hour and then burned again, settle at last into something like warmth. On the 4th morning, they came over the last ridge and saw the silver halls of Caerwyn in the distance. Smoke was rising from the southern quarter of the city. Rovan reined in sharply. Varric came galloping back up the road a moment later, his horse lathered, his face the color of wet ash. "My king," he said, before he had even stopped. "The warden has moved. He took the inner keep at dawn. He has 50 hostages in the great chamber. He has named a regency in your absence. And my king, he has—" Varric stopped. He looked at Kaelin, then at Mavel. "Speak," Rovan said. "She has a right to hear it." "He has published a proclamation," Varric said. "Under his own seal. It declares the existence of a false whelp sired by a usurper on a common woman. It names the boy. It names the village. It calls for his death as a threat to the true succession. My king, the proclamation went out 6 days ago, to every village between here and the sea." The blood left Mavel's face in a single beat. "They named him," she said, "in writing. Everywhere." "Yes, my lady." "Then there is nowhere to hide him now." "No, my lady." Rovan's hands on the reins had gone white. "There is something else," Varric said, more quietly. "Among the hostages in the great chamber, the old woman, the widow from Briarmoss, Heston. The warden's men took her from her cottage 4 days ago." Kaelin, who had been quiet in the saddle, made a small sound. "She fed our goats," he whispered. Mavel closed her eyes. She had led them to Heston, by leaving, by the fact of her absence. The warden had swept up the small good woman who had once helped her bring a child into the world on a loft floor, and the warden had done it because he had known, somehow, that the widow's name would mean something to her. Mavel opened her eyes. "We ride now," she said. "Not tomorrow. Now." Rovan looked at her. Something in his face, for the first time in 4 days, allowed itself a small, grim smile. "My queen," he said. And the small, quiet company went down from the ridge at a hard gallop toward the burning city, with the boy held tight against his mother's chest and the Alpha King riding at their flank, and the mark on Mavel's wrist burning so hot and so bright that she could feel the answering fire of it through the cloak of the man beside her. 2 halves of an old broken thing drawing together at last across 7 years of winter. The outer wall of Caerwyn fell before midday. The warden had expected loyalty from the king's own guard and had received 1/3 of what he had counted on. Varric had spent 7 years placing quiet men in quiet positions, and those men, when the true king rode up to the western gate with his mate and his son, opened the gate from the inside without being asked. The fighting that followed in the outer city was brief and ugly, and Mavel did not watch it. She sat with Kaelin in a small stone guardhouse near the gate, her arms around him, her cheek pressed to the top of his dark head, and she listened to the sounds of wolves retaking their own city, and did not permit herself to think about any of the individual sounds inside that larger sound. Rovan came back to the guardhouse at noon. There was blood on his collar that was not his. He knelt in front of Kaelin without touching him. "Kaelin," he said, "your mother has told you that you are safe with me. That is true. I need to ask you to be very brave for 1 more hour. Can you do that?" Kaelin looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then he said, "Yes." "Thank you," Rovan said. He rose. He did not try to touch the boy's hair or his shoulder. He only looked at him once more, as a man looks at something he intends to keep alive, and then he turned to Mavel. "The warden has barricaded himself in the great chamber with the hostages," he said. Heston is alive. He has not yet begun the executions. He is waiting for me. He wants to negotiate. He knows by now that I have you. He will not negotiate, Mavel said. No. He will try to kill you both in front of me. Rovin's eyes were very level. He believes that if he can break me in the sight of my own court, the court will accept his regency as the only sane remaining option. He has been preparing for this moment for 7 years. Then we will break him first. Mavel. He did not move closer to her. I am asking you not to enter that chamber. I know you are. I am asking. I know, Rovin. She rose. Kaelin slid to the floor and stood very close against her hip, one small hand fisted in the hem of her cloak. I spent 7 years being told what to do by the absence of you. I will not now be told what to do by the presence of you. Heston is in that room because of me. My son's name is on a parchment in every village in the north because I ran. I am not running anymore. Not into a cellar, not into a forest, and not behind you. He closed his eyes for one beat. Yes, he said. She knelt down in front of her son. She had promised herself in the long ride of the last day that she would do this before she went through any door from which she might not come back. She took Kaelin's small, serious face between her hands. Kaelin, she said. I want to tell you who the man in the garden is, before I go into the big room. Kaelin's storm-gray eyes did not waver from hers. He is your father, she said. Kaelin did not speak. He did not know you were alive. People lied to him for a long time. He has been looking for us for 7 years. He is a good man, Kaelin. He is your father, and he is a good man. And if I do not come back out of the big room, you are going to go with him, and he is going to love you for the rest of your life. Do you understand me? Kaelin nodded, once, slowly. I love you, she said. I love you, Mother, he said. She rose. She did not look at Rovin. She did not trust what her face would do if she looked at him. She walked out of the guardhouse and through the courtyard and across the stone bridge and up into the silver halls of Carowin for the first time in 7 years, and she did not look back. At the great chamber, she stopped. 2 of the warden's men stood at the doors. They did not speak. They opened the doors. The chamber was long and high-raftered and lit by the cold gray light of morning through the tall windows. The hostages knelt in a line down its center. Heston was among them. She was smaller than Mavel remembered, and her hair had gone entirely white, and when her eyes found Mavel's across the chamber, she began to weep without a sound. On the stepped throne at the far end sat an old man in a silver throat vine collar, and beside him, pale and perfectly still, stood Andrina of House Ivar. Step forward, the High Warden said. Slowly, hands where I can see them. She stepped forward. Closer. She stepped closer. She was almost at the foot of the dais when the warden, without any warning, without any flourish, without even rising from his chair, lifted a small dark crossbow from beside his knee and fired the bolt into her chest. The chamber made a sound. Mavel looked down. The bolt had gone through her cloak and through the front of her dress and was standing out of her just below the collarbone. There was very little blood yet. She could feel the cold of the iron inside her, like a hand that had reached through her and taken hold of something. A dead hostage has no use, the warden said conversationally, but a dead mother has. The boy will grieve. Grieving heirs are easy to manage. Mavel's knees began to fold. Somewhere very far away, through the bond, she felt Rovin's mind break open. And then, from the line of kneeling hostages, a small, clear voice said, Mother. She had not heard Kaelin enter the chamber. She did not know how he had entered the chamber. She turned her head, and her son was standing in the open doorway, barefoot, his small hand held out toward her, and from his palm, bright and clean and alive, a light the color of a winter sunrise was pouring into the air between them. The mark on Mavel's wrist answered it. Her body, which had been folding toward the floor, stopped folding. Every suppressed, swallowed, locked-away piece of what she was came up at once. a tide she had held against for 7 years, and her son's small light, and her own long silence, met somewhere above the stone floor of the great chamber, and became something the warden had never in his calculations accounted for. The bolt in her chest began, very slowly, to push itself back out of her. The bolt came out of her, and fell to the stones with a small clean sound, and Mayvel did not fall with it. She stood on the polished floor of the great chamber with her son's winter-colored light washing up her body from her ankles to her throat, and the wound under her collarbone closed itself in front of the warden's eyes like a door being quietly shut. There was no blood on her dress. There was no torn cloth. There was only the warm, steady pulse of the mark on her wrist, answering the steady pulse of the small hand held out toward her from the doorway, and the growing understanding in the chamber that something had happened here that the warden had not accounted for and could not undo. For the first time since she had known his name, the High Warden of Carowin looked afraid. He rose from the throne. The small dark crossbow was still in his hand. He swung it toward the doorway, toward the barefoot child standing there with the light in his palm, and Mayvel heard herself say, in a voice that was not entirely her own, "No." The warden's hand stopped moving. Not because he had chosen to stop it. His hand simply would not continue. His fingers were open around the crossbow, and the crossbow was falling, and he was staring at his own hand as if it had been borrowed from someone else and handed back wrong. "Kneel," Mayvel said. The warden knelt. Andrina of House Ivar, pale and perfectly still beside the throne, knelt a half-beat later, and Mayvel saw in the woman's face not triumph undone, but the specific exhausted relief of a person who has been carrying someone else's weight for 7 years and has finally been allowed to set it down. The doors of the great chamber came off their hinges. Rovin had not taken the time to open them. He came through them as wolf, and the wolf was enormous and silent and very fast, and he crossed the length of the chamber in 4 bounds and stopped at her shoulder and pressed the side of his great shaggy head against her hip, hard enough to rock her 1/2 step sideways. She put her hand on his neck without looking down. The fur was warm. He was shaking. The warden's men, the ones who had been standing behind the hostages with drawn blades, had dropped the blades. One of them was already walking toward the wall with his hands empty and raised. Varric's people were coming in through the high doors behind Rovin, quiet and fast and thorough, and within the span of a dozen breaths, the great chamber of Carowin was under its own king again. Mayvel did not watch any of it. She walked the length of the chamber past the kneeling warden and past the kneeling false queen, and she did not stop until she reached the doorway where her son stood. She knelt in front of him. The light in his palm had gone out. He looked tired. He looked small. He looked like a 6-year-old boy who had walked through a door he was not supposed to walk through. "Kaelin," she said. "I felt you," he said. "The bad thing inside you. I felt it through the thing on your wrist. I was not going to let it stay there." She pulled him against her chest. She held him so hard that she felt the bones of him through his nightshirt, and he wrapped his arms around her neck and pressed his cold, small nose into the hollow of her throat. And somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of a very large wolf shifting back into the shape of a man. And then she heard Rovin's footsteps, quiet and careful, stop a respectful distance away. She turned her head without letting go of her son. Rovin was on one knee. "Kaelin," he said. Kaelin lifted his face from Mayvel's shoulder. He looked at the man in the doorway. He did not let go of his mother. "You are my father," he said. "Yes. Mother told me this morning." "I know. She told me you did not know about me." "I did not know about you, Kaelin. If I had known, I would have come sooner. I have been looking for your mother for 7 years. I would have been looking for you, too, if anyone had told me you were there to be looked for." Kaelin considered this with the same grave stillness with which he considered every new herb she had ever taught him. Then he said, "My mother is tired. She has been tired for a long time." Rovin's throat moved. "I know," You are going to help her not be tired anymore. I am going to try. Kalen thought about this. Then he said, quite calmly, "All right." He did not move out of his mother's arms. He did not go to his father. But he reached one small hand across the space between them, and Rovin, who had clearly learned at some cost in the last days what was his to take and what was his to be given, extended 2 fingers and let the boy curl his small hand around them. That was how the 3 of them stayed for a long minute in the open doorway of the great chamber of Carowin, while the kingdom quietly rearranged itself around them. The warden was judged 9 days later before the assembled Pax. He spoke in his own defense for most of a morning. His defense convinced no one, and when the judgment came down, it was carried out by an old northern rite that required no executioner and no blade, only the silent circle of wolves who had been wronged by him. What his body weighed by sundown was no longer of interest to the kingdom. Andrina of House Ivar was not tried. She was, after careful questioning, released to her mother's people in the north, where she asked for and was granted a small holding on the coldest stretch of the coast, and where she lived out her life quietly tending a light on a headland, and never once asked for any of what had briefly and falsely been hers. The harvests recovered slowly, the way a body recovers from a long fever. The border packs came in one by one to renew their oaths, and the oaths this time were sworn not only to the Alpha King, but to the woman at his side, and to the grave, quiet child who stood half a step in front of them both. The people of Carowin, who had expected to resent the healer from the river villages, did not resent her. They had watched their king unravel for 7 years. They could feel, when she walked among them, the mending. Mavel did not become queen quickly. She refused the silver circlet the first time it was offered. She refused it the second time. The third time, on a morning in late summer in the small private garden behind the silver halls, Rovin knelt in the grass in front of her, the way he had knelt in the wet grass of her garden in Briar Moss, and he asked her not to wear it for him or for the kingdom, but only so that when Kalen stood beside her at the council table, no one in the room would be permitted to doubt which woman was his mother. She wore it after that. The bond was completed on the first cold night of autumn. They were alone in the small stone chapel behind the northern tower. Kalen was asleep in the rooms below. There was no ceremony. There were no witnesses. Rovin had offered her a great public sealing in the silver halls, with every lord of Carowin in attendance. And she had said, very gently, "No. The last public sealing in this hall was not real. Ours will not need a hall." He had agreed. In the stone chapel, under a single candle, she placed her mouth against the line of his throat where his pulse lived, and she let her teeth find the place where the old mark of their first claiming had faded almost to nothing in 7 years of silver throat and grief. She closed her mouth. The bond came back the way rivers come back after a drought. Slow, and then all at once, and then with such force that she could not have said, for a long moment, whose grief she was feeling, or whose relief, or whose love. She saw the silver halls through his eyes on the morning he woke. She saw him waking in a bed he did not remember going to, with a woman in the next room he did not remember marrying, and she saw him cross the floor in his nightshirt and stand in the corridor and begin to call her name in a voice that kept rising in pitch until it was not a voice anymore. She saw him throw Andrina of House Ivar out of his wing in the small hours of that first bad morning. She saw the 7 years of searching, the nights he had not slept, the way his wolf had begun to wear down inside him until Varric had begun to hide the long knives from his rooms. She saw the small false grave on the hill behind the silver halls that he had kept for 2 years, and the morning he had learned it was false, and the specific sound he had made when he had learned it. He saw her too. He saw her on the straw of a loft in a village he had never heard of, bleeding and alone, biting down on a strip of her own cloak, so that Heston the widow would not hear her cry out. He saw the first word, the first fever, the first herb named in the boy's small, serious voice. He saw the nights she had sat by the hearth and whispered his name into the fire because she had believed, for 7 years, that whispering it to fire was the only safe place left to say it. He saw, at the very end, the morning 4 masked men had stood in her garden, and she had stepped between them and her son, with nothing but a paring knife in her hand, because that was the shape she had made of herself in the long absence of him. When she drew her mouth back from his throat, they were both weeping, and neither of them was ashamed. "I am sorry," Rovan said, "for all of it. I know. I will spend the rest of my life being sorry for it." "I know, Rovan, but you will also spend the rest of your life with us, and that is worth more than the sorrow." Kalen was 9 years old the first time he shifted. It happened on a bright, cold morning in the orchard behind the Silver Halls, where his father had taken him to teach him the names of the apple varieties. One moment he was a small, serious boy reaching up for a low branch, and the next he was a young gray wolf with storm-colored eyes sitting startled in the grass, with one of his own small boots still half on his hind foot. He looked up at his father with an expression of such complete offended dignity that Rovan sat down in the grass beside him and laughed. For the first time, anyone in the Silver Halls could remember him laughing in a decade. Mayvel watched them from the kitchen garden. Her hand was on her wrist without her noticing. The half-moon mark had healed, across the long autumn of the bond's completion, into a small, clean silver scar that did not hurt, and did not burn, and did not pulse anymore. It simply sat there on the inside of her wrist, quiet, like a small closed door that no one needed to open again. Later, much later, when Kalen was grown and there were 2 younger sisters running half-wild through the orchard, and an old friend of the family named Heston had moved into a warm stone cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden, Mayvel would sit in the evenings on the low wall behind the Silver Halls and watch the lights coming on in the city below, and she would think sometimes about the girl who had run out of the servants' gate on a rainy spring night 7 lifetimes ago. She would not pity the girl. She would only sit in the dusk with her husband's shoulder against her own and watch the lanterns bloom across Carowan one by one and listen to her son somewhere in the orchard teaching his sisters the old names of the herbs and know that every road she had been forced to walk and every road she had chosen had brought her at last to this wall and this dusk and this shoulder and this sound. The wolves of Carowan lifted their voices in the hills above the city as the last light went. It was not a howl of grief. It had not been, for a long time. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.